The air was heavy with the kind of silence that only happens in neatly trimmed, rule-bound neighborhoods where lawns are cut in perfect lines and driveways gleam with waxed SUVs. But in that silence lurked a storm, one that had been building for weeks, and tonight it was going to break. And at the center of it all was Karen, the self-declared queen of the HOA, marching toward what she thought was a small victory but what would turn into the single worst mistake of her life. Karen was a woman who had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade, and she believed that tenure gave her ownership of everyone else's choices. Her blonde hair was tied tight in a bun, her mouth pinched into a permanent frown, and her eyes darted across every driveway, yard, and porch like a hawk searching for prey. People whispered that she kept a binder full of HOA violations, organized by household, complete with time-stamped photos. For her, it wasn't about improving the neighborhood, it was about control. She liked having the final say, the power to decide what belonged and what didn't. And from the moment Marcus Taylor moved in, she decided he didn't. Marcus wasn't loud, didn't throw parties, didn't let weeds overrun his yard. In fact, his house was spotless, his lawn neatly edged, his porch decorated with tasteful plants. But what gnawed at Karen was the Jeep parked in his driveway. It was no ordinary vehicle. Rugged, all-terrain, painted in matte black. It had the presence of something built for rougher roads than their smooth suburban streets. It wasn't flashy, but it stood out. And Karen hated anything that stood out, especially when it was owned by someone she already disapproved of. From the beginning, she treated Marcus like an intruder. Notes appeared on his door. Your vehicle violates community appearance standards. Driveways must be free of unsightly or unapproved vehicles. Please park inside your garage. Marcus read each one, sighed, and filed them away. He'd been warned about HOA types before moving in, but he had hoped this neighborhood would be different. Fortunately, it wasn't. Still, Marcus kept his composure. He was polite in every brief interaction. If Karen cornered him while he was getting the mail, he would smile, nod, and say, "I'll take care of it," without committing to anything. He never raised his voice, never showed anger. That calmness infuriated Karen more than anything. She wanted resistance so she could feel justified in her campaign against him. But Marcus gave her nothing, just silence and that maddening smile. What Karen didn't know was that the Jeep wasn't just a car. Marcus wasn't just a homeowner trying to mind his business. He was part of a multi-agency police task force that specialized in dismantling organized crime networks. His Jeep was a covert surveillance unit, equipped with hidden cameras, GPS trackers, encrypted radios, and enough surveillance tech to make an entire precinct jealous. It wasn't parked outside by accident. It was positioned strategically, watching certain patterns in the neighborhood that Marcus had been assigned to monitor. Every day it sat there. It quietly collected data that would one day help take down a dangerous group operating in the area. Marcus lived two lives to the world. He was just a quiet new neighbor. In reality, he was working cases that required him to blend into ordinary communities, gathering evidence under the radar. If Karen had known the truth, she might have backed off. But Karen never cared to ask, never cared to know. In her mind, Marcus was a nuisance who needed to be put in his place. Weeks of festering irritation turned into obsession. Karen began plotting ways to get rid of the Jeep. She filed complaint after complaint with the HOA board, citing bylaws and obscure regulations. But the board wasn't as ruthless as she was. It dismissed her claims, saying the Jeep wasn't technically in violation. That answer made her blood boil. If the board wouldn't enforce the rules, then she would. That Friday evening, Karen snapped, standing in her kitchen, staring out the window at the Jeep, gleaming faintly under the streetlight. She muttered, "Not in my neighborhood." She grabbed her oversized tote bag and shoved in a pair of bolt cutters she'd borrowed from her brother, convinced that tonight she'd rid the neighborhood of the eyesore once and for all. The night was sticky and warm, the kind of summer air that clings to your skin. Karen stomped across her lawn in flip-flops, the bolt cutters heavy in her hand. She moved with the righteousness of someone who believed she was on a mission for the greater good. Every step was fueled by weeks of pent-up frustration, every breath a whisper of self-justification. This is what leaders do. I'm protecting property values. I'm enforcing order. Marcus's driveway gate was secured with a thick chain and lock. Karen crouched down, sweat rolling down her temples, and positioned the cutters around the lock. "You don't belong here," she hissed to the Jeep, as if it were alive. With a grunt, she squeezed the handles. The lock snapped with a sharp, metallic crack that echoed down the quiet street. She froze, heart racing, glancing around as though expecting applause. But the silence held. Satisfied, she tossed the lock onto the grass. "Easy," she whispered to herself, pulling the gate open. The Jeep loomed before her, a silent beast of steel and shadow. She yanked the driver's side door open, climbed inside, and sat heavily. In the seat, the leather creaked beneath her, and she adjusted her sunglasses even though it was night, imagining herself in control. Karen wasn't stealing the Jeep, at least, not in her mind. No, she was relocating it. She'd drive it down the street, park it outside the community, and call a tow truck. That way she could tell the board she had handled the problem they refused to address. In her twisted logic, she was a hero. But the moment she turned the ignition, a small light blinked red on the Jeep's dashboard. Karen didn't notice it. She was too busy smirking at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Downtown, in a dimly lit operations room filled with screens, an alarm went off. Red text scrolled across the monitors. "Unauthorized access, Unit 6. Technicians scrambled." Calling out alerts, radios crackled as team leaders barked orders. "Unit 6 has been compromised. GPS ping active. All teams respond." Karen hummed to herself as she backed the Jeep out of the driveway, pleased at her handiwork. She imagined Marcus's face the next morning when he found the vehicle gone. She imagined the board praising her for her initiative. Imagined the other neighbors whispering about her leadership. What she couldn't imagine was the fleet of black SUVs already tearing through city streets. Sirens muted but lights ready, heading straight toward. Her Karen had no idea that her bolt cutters had just shattered more than a lock. They had shattered months of undercover surveillance. They had triggered a task force response designed for criminals, not clueless suburban tyrants. She wasn't just meddling with a neighbor anymore. She had stepped into a battlefield she didn't understand, and every second she kept driving. The storm closed in tighter. The Jeep rumbled softly as Karen steered it down the winding suburban road, her lips curling into a self-satisfied grin. She could already feel the thrill of victory, imagining how the HOA board would marvel at her courage once they learned she had handled the nuisance vehicle herself. In her head, she rehearsed her speech. Sometimes you have to do what's right for the community, even when others don't have the backbone to act. She didn't notice the faint clicking of the hidden devices in the Jeep, or the pulsing light beneath the dashboard that tracked her every move. She didn't realize that every turn of the steering wheel, every press of the pedal, was being broadcast in real time to a secure command center filled with law enforcement officers who now believed a hostile actor had just stolen government property. Downtown, the operations center buzzed with urgency. Screens displayed GPS coordinates moving away from Marcus's house, and red alerts blinked across maps. "Unauthorized operator detected," a technician announced, his voice sharp with alarm. "Unit 6 has been breached. Vehicle is moving. Eastbound, speed 35. Commander stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "All right, we don't take chances. Deploy teams. I want air support overhead within 5 minutes. Let's get eyes on that vehicle before this escalates." Within moments, the silent streets of the city were alive with unseen motion. Black SUVs rolled out of hidden garages, their headlights dark to avoid drawing attention. A police helicopter lifted off the ground from a nearby hangar, its blades slicing through the night air. The task force moved like a machine, swift and precise, because they had no way of knowing if the thief was a gang member, a cartel enforcer, or something worse. Meanwhile, Karen turned the Jeep onto the main road, humming a tune under her breath. She adjusted the seat, admiring how comfortably it held her, and glanced at the array of buttons and switches on the console. It looked far more advanced than any vehicle she had ever driven, and though curiosity tugged at her, she decided not to touch anything. "This thing looks like it belongs in a movie," she muttered, laughing to herself. and they think it belongs here? Ridiculous. But Karen's humor didn't last long. As she drove farther, a subtle awareness crept in the feeling of being watched. She glanced in her rearview mirror, expecting to see another car, but the road behind her was empty. The night pressed in around her, heavy and strange. She shook her head. Get it together, Karen. You're doing the neighborhood a favor. That's all. Back at his home, Marcus stood in his driveway, phone pressed to his ear. He had returned from a late-night grocery run to find the chain cut and his Jeep gone. He didn't need the blinking red light on his key fob to tell him what had happened. He already knew. Only one person in this neighborhood was brazen and foolish enough to do this. He could almost picture Karen's smug face as she drove off, believing she had one. Yes, he said into the phone, his voice calm but firm. It's not a hostile breach. I know exactly who took it. Civilian, white female, late 40s, approximately 5'6", blonde hair, known for. Let's just call it extreme pettiness. No, she's not a threat. She's a nuisance. But she doesn't know what she's driving. The agent on the other end sighed audibly. We already have units tracking the Jeep, protocols in motion. Can't call them off until we secure the vehicle. Marcus pinched the bridge of his nose. Understood. But let me handle this when you catch up with her. Trust me, you don't want to make this bigger than it already is. I'll meet the team at the intercept point. Karen, oblivious to the chaos she'd unleashed, continued driving toward the edge of the neighborhood. She planned to leave the Jeep at a strip mall parking lot she knew was outside the HOA's jurisdiction. Her plan was simple. Abandon it, call for a tow, and then triumphantly return to tell the board the eyesore was gone. But as she pulled onto the highway, headlights suddenly flared in her rearview mirror. Two black SUVs appeared out of nowhere, sliding into position behind her. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. What the? She whispered, squinting at the dark shapes.
Ouch.
They kept their distance, but matched her every move. For the first time, doubt flickered in her mind. She pressed harder on the gas pedal. Testing them. Instantly, the SUVs sped up too, closing in. Panic flared in her chest. This isn't funny, she muttered, her voice trembling now. She tried to laugh it off, but her palms were slick with sweat. Moments later, a helicopter appeared above her, its spotlight cutting a glaring beam across the highway. The roar of the blades drowned out her thoughts. Oh my God, Karen cried, swerving slightly in fright. She had no idea who these people were or why they cared so much about this Jeep. In her mind, the only explanation was that Marcus had called in some gang or criminal friends to scare her off. The SUVs accelerated, boxing her in. A booming voice came through a hidden speaker inside the Jeep. Driver of the vehicle, pull over immediately. You're in possession of federal property. Failure to comply will result in forceful intervention. Karen's jaw dropped. Property? Her heart raced. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She couldn't reconcile the words with the reality she thought she knew. This was supposed to be a simple act of neighborhood improvement. How had it turned into a federal manhunt? No, this can't be happening, she cried, her voice shrill. She slammed on the brakes, the Jeep screeching to a halt on the shoulder of the highway. The SUV skidded to a stop around her, doors flying open. Men in tactical gear emerged, rifles raised, their faces grim beneath black helmets. The helicopter's spotlight bore down on her like judgment itself. Karen raised her hands, shaking uncontrollably. I'm not a criminal. I was just moving it, she stammered, her voice breaking, blurred her vision, as the agents approached cautiously. Step out of the vehicle, one of them commanded. She scrambled out, nearly tripping, her flip-flops slapping against the pavement. Please, I'm with the HOA. I was just trying to... Her words faltered as she realized how insane it sounded. She looked around at the agents, at the rifles, at the helicopter above, and her knees nearly buckled. She had never felt so small. So powerless then, through the chaos, a familiar figure stepped out of one of the SUVs. Marcus, calm and composed, walked toward her. He wore no tactical gear, just his plain clothes, but the agents instantly deferred to him, lowering their weapons slightly. His badge gleamed faintly as he held it up. Karen's mouth opened in shock. You. She gasped, pointing a trembling finger at him. Marcus stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. Yes, me. Before you say anything, let me make this very clear. That Jeep you thought was an eyesore? It's a task force vehicle? Federal property? Outfitted with equipment you couldn't begin to understand. And when you cut that lock and decided to take matters into your own hands, you didn't just break HOA rules. You compromised an active operation. Karen shook her head wildly, tears streaming down her face. No, I didn't know. I thought you don't belong here. Your car didn't belong here. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his calm voice cutting sharper than any shout could. Didn't belong here? Or you didn't want me here? She had no answer. Her mouth opened and closed, but the words wouldn't come. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, then turned to the lead agent. She's not a hostile, just a nosy neighbor with too much time on her hands. Book her for trespassing and destruction of property. I'll handle the rest. Karen gasped, her knees giving way as two agents stepped forward to cuff her. No, please. I was trying to protect the neighborhood. I didn't know. She sobbed. Marcus didn't even look at her as they led her away. He simply turned back to his Jeep, brushing dust from the door, his face unreadable. Inside, though, he felt a mixture of anger and resignation. Karen had wanted a fight. She'd gotten one, but not the kind she imagined. And as the convoy prepared to leave the highway, Karen realized with dawning horror that her crusade to control one man had spiraled into a nightmare she couldn't escape. The hum of the helicopter faded into the distance, but the weight of its spotlight still burned in Karen's memory as she sat on the cold asphalt of the highway shoulder, wrists cuffed tightly behind her back. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her cheeks wet with tears she couldn't stop. The biting steel of the handcuffs felt unreal, as though she had fallen into someone else's nightmare. How had it come to this? She had started the evening convinced she was the savior of the neighborhood. And now she was surrounded by armored vehicles, federal agents, and the neighbor she had despised standing at the center of it all. Calm and untouchable. Marcus walked past her without a glance, giving orders to the team securing the Jeep. His composure was absolute, the kind of quiet authority that made the heavily armed agents defer to him without question. Karen stared at him, shaking her head in disbelief. This couldn't be real. This man she had mocked at board meetings, whose property she had reported for known compliance, whose presence she had whispered about with venom to other HOA members, was the one in charge. The one who now held the power to decide. Her fate, she wanted to scream that it wasn't fair, that she didn't know. That no one told her the Jeep was anything other than an unsightly box in their perfect community. But deep inside, a gnawing truth festered. She hadn't cared to know. She hadn't cared who Marcus really was, what his story might be, or why he kept to himself. All she cared about was the image she thought the neighborhood should have, and Marcus had never fit into that picture. The agents pulled her up from the ground and guided her into the back seat of one of the SUVs. The leather was cold against her skin, and the child locks clicked shut with a finality that made her chest tighten. She pressed her forehead against the window, staring out at the flashing lights and shadows of the task force moving in coordinated efficiency. Her stomach churned with dread. Marcus approached the SUV, his stride steady. The agent in the passenger seat opened the door, and for a moment Karen's heart leaped. Maybe he would listen, maybe he would understand. But when Marcus leaned down, his eyes meeting hers, all she saw there was an ocean of restrained fury. You wanted me gone so badly. Karen, he said, his voice low but steady. Now look where it got you. She shook her head, her words tumbling out in a rush. I didn't. No. I thought it was just your Jeep. I thought it was an eyesore. I was trying to keep the neighborhood safe, Marcus. You have to believe me. Marcus's gaze didn't waver. Safe from what? From me? From something you didn't understand? You thought you were above the law, but you just ran straight into it hard. Tears spilled down her face again, and her voice broke. Please, please don't let them charge me. It was a mistake. I'll replace the lock. I'll pay for damages. I'll do whatever it takes." He leaned closer, his tone icy. "You don't get to decide the cost of your actions. Not anymore," Karen sobbed, watching him pull back as the agent shut the door. The convoy moved off the highway, heading toward the federal station, where she would be processed. The silence in the SUV was suffocating, broken only by the occasional crackle of the radio. Every mile stretched her panic thinner, until it threatened to snap at the station. They led her into a sterile room, sat her down, and began the formal booking process. Fingerprints, mugshot, personal belongings in a plastic bag. Karen's mind spun with humiliation. She had spent years wielding the HOA as her weapon, lording over her neighbors with petty rules and citations. Now she was the one stripped of dignity, cataloged and processed like any common criminal. Hours passed before Marcus returned. Karen's head jerked up as he entered, his badge glinting under the fluorescent light. He dismissed the attending officer with a nod, leaving just the two of them in the room. For the first time since the ordeal began, Karen felt truly cornered. Marcus sat across from her, folding his hands on the table. He studied her in silence, and she squirmed under his gaze. Silently he spoke. "Do you know how close you came to ruining something much bigger than you?" She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I didn't know, Marcus. I swear I didn't. I wasn't trying to sabotage anything. I just thought you were entitled to make decisions that weren't yours to make." Marcus cut in sharply. "You thought your dislike for me gave you permission to act without consequence. That's the problem." She flinched. At his words, the truth in them slicing through her flimsy excuses. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice small. "I really am. Please, Marcus. I can't go to jail. My reputation, my family, everything. It'll destroy me." His jaw tightened. For a long moment, he said nothing. His mind replayed every petty violation notice she had left on his door. Every time she had tried to paint him as less than, every sneer and whisper about how he didn't fit in her perfect neighborhood. A part of him wanted to let the system devour her, to let her feel the full weight of the law she had so carelessly disregarded. But another part of him, the part that wore the badge, understood the importance of justice, tempered with wisdom. Finally, he leaned back. "You're lucky," he said quietly. "You're lucky that I know this was arrogance, not malice. Lucky that the operation wasn't compromised beyond recovery. Lucky that I still believe in giving people the chance to learn from their mistakes." Karen blinked, hope flickering in her eyes. So you'll let me go?" His gaze hardened again. "No, not without consequences. You'll be charged with trespassing and property damage. Those charges will stick. But the federal charges, the ones that would have landed you in prison, for years I'll make sure those are dropped. You'll face the community you claim to protect, and you'll face them as a criminal, not a savior." Her heart sank. Even with his mercy, her life in the neighborhood would never be the same. She could already imagine the whispers, the stares, the headlines, if word spread. Karen, the iron-fisted queen of the HOA, brought low by her own arrogance. Marcus stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "You wanted control over everything, Karen, but control comes with responsibility. And tonight, you showed you can't handle either. Remember that when you're standing in front of the people you tried so hard to impress?" He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a hollow thud. Weeks later, Karen stood in court, the charges laid bare for all to hear. Her neighbors sat in the gallery, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and, in some cases, satisfaction. The judge delivered her sentence: probation, mandatory community service, and a hefty fine. It wasn't prison. It was enough to shatter the image Karen had so carefully curated. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, microphones thrust toward her face. She kept her head down, her once proud posture hunched in shame. Behind the crowd, Marcus watched quietly, his expression unreadable. He hadn't needed revenge. The truth had done the work for him. Karen returned to the neighborhood a shadow of her former self. The HOA board ousted her within a week, and her influence evaporated overnight. The very neighbors she once lorded over now crossed the street. To avoid her, she was alone, Trapped in the community she had ruled with an iron fist, her name forever tainted. Marcus, meanwhile, carried on with his work, his Jeep restored to its rightful place. Neighbors who once kept their distance now greeted him with respect, their eyes opened by the spectacle of Karen's downfall. He hadn't asked for vindication, but it had arrived all the same. And as Karen sat on her porch in the evenings watching, Marcus's Jeep parked securely behind a new, reinforced lock. She was haunted by the lesson she had learned too late. That power built on prejudice and arrogance always collapses under its own weight. That was the end of her reign and the beginning of his peace.